5:30 a.m. December 16th, 1944. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the silence shattered as German artillery opened fire. Shells burst in the treetops, turning wood and steel into a deadly rain. For most units, it was the beginning of a nightmare. For 18 Americans, it was the start of a legend. On a small snow-covered ridge near the Belgian village of Lanzerath, the men of the 394th Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon lay buried in timber-roofed foxholes. They weren't line infantry or tank crews. On paper, they were scouts, eyes and ears, not a wall meant to stop an army. Their commander, Second Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, was only 20 years old. He looked more like a college student than a hardened veteran. Out of the 25 men in his platoon, just 18 were on that ridge when the barrage began. The others were out on patrol, unaware of what was coming. To the east, hidden by fog and forest, the 1st SS Panzer Division was on the move. Tanks, half-tracks, and thousands of troops rolled forward. This was Hitler's armored spearhead, the tip of his last great gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was brutally simple: punch through the thin American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize Antwerp. If they could split the British and American armies and choke off Allied supplies, they might turn the tide of the war, or at least force a political crisis in the West. On the big situation map, Lanzerath was just another small village along the route. But in reality, it sat in a dangerous 5-kilometer gap between two American divisions. It was a quiet seam in the line that, if torn open, could unravel the entire northern flank. A week before the attack, Bouck received his orders. Move the I&R Platoon to Lanzerath, observe, report, and plug the gap. It sounded like a routine mission for a reconnaissance unit. No one told him that he would be standing in the path of the main German thrust. When Bouck arrived, he did what good scouts do best. He walked the ground. To the west of the village, a gentle slope ran down into an open field, divided by waist-high barbed wire. Beyond it, a dark wall of pine trees offered concealment and cover. The terrain was dangerous but also full of opportunities. Another American unit had used the ridge before and left behind a few shallow foxholes. Bouck knew they wouldn't be enough. He ordered his men to dig deeper, to carve out proper fighting positions. They roofed the holes with pine logs, covered them with dirt, and let the falling snow hide the scars. Slowly, a curved defensive line took shape along the ridge, stretching about 250 to 300 meters. Each foxhole was positioned to cover the front and overlap with the next, creating deadly crossing fire. From the field below, it looked like nothing but smooth, untouched snow. The platoon's firepower was limited but well handled. 2 BARs to lay down fast automatic fire, a single 30 caliber machine gun to anchor the line, and a mix of M1 Garens and carbines in the hands of fit, carefully selected scouts. No tanks, no heavy artillery, just 18 determined men in good positions. At 5:30 that morning, 1,600 German guns opened up along the Ardennes front. Around Lanzerath, shells burst in the tree canopy, sending flaming splinters and shrapnel down onto the ridge. The ground shook, and the air turned into smoke and choking dust. Inside the timbered foxholes, the men held their breath. Dirt sifted down on their helmets. The log roofs groaned, and every blast felt like it would be the one to bury them alive. But Bouck's insistence on strong cover paid off. When the barrage finally eased, his platoon was shaken but still alive. Bouck crawled to the observation post and raised his binoculars. Through the morning mist, he could see them. A long, dark column of German paratroopers moving toward the village. 400, maybe 500 Fallschirmjäger veteran infantry, not just a few scattered patrols. He grabbed the radio and called regimental headquarters. Calmly but urgently, he described what he saw and asked permission to withdraw to a more secure position. With so few men, a fighting retreat made sense. The answer he received was short and final. Hold your position at all costs. That order changed everything. There would be no pullback, no planned escape route into the forest. Headquarters didn't send reinforcements, and no artillery support was promised. Whether they liked it or not, Bouck and his 18 men had just become the front line. He returned to the foxholes and looked at his men, tired, cold, but steady. He didn't tell them about the exact size of the force coming their way. Instead, he gave clear, simple instructions. Let them get close. Don't fire until I blow the whistle. Make every shot count. Earlier that morning, a 4-man artillery observation team had joined them on the ridge. With their radios, maps, and experience, they could have turned the hillside into a killing zone, walking artillery fire straight across the German column. But the barrage had cut the phone lines. Their link to the guns was gone. Late in the morning, 3 German officers and several escorts stepped away from the main road and moved across the open field below the ridge. They walked casually, scanning the area, unaware they were under the sights of American rifles. Bouck watched them, waiting for the perfect moment. Then a small, ordinary scene tilted the balance. A Belgian girl stepped out of a nearby house, spoke briefly to one of the officers, and pointed down a side road. From her doorway, she was simply giving directions. From Bouck's angle, it looked like she was pointing straight at his hidden positions. Convinced they'd been exposed, he raised the whistle and blew. In an instant, the quiet hillside exploded into sound. 18 rifles, 2 BARs, and a machine gun opened fire as one. The German officers dropped first, cut down before they could react. Their escorts dove for cover, some falling, others crawling desperately toward the nearest ditch. For the German paratroopers, it was a shocking moment. All morning they had marched through what seemed like an undefended sector. Now, out of nowhere, a wall of invisible gunfire tore through their ranks. The open field that had looked so harmless became a deadly funnel. Within minutes, dozens of Germans were dead or wounded. The survivors hugged the ground, pressed into shallow drainage ditches, and shouted to each other over the crack of bullets. They still didn't know how many Americans were firing, or from exactly where. German commanders quickly ordered an assault. 2 platoons were sent forward to storm the ridge directly. They sprinted across the open ground, trying to reach the barbed wire and close with the defenders. On paper, they had the numbers. In reality, they were running into overlapping arcs of well-aimed fire. Each time a German soldier tried to rise from cover or cut through the wire, the Americans fired. Helmets flew, bodies collapsed, and momentum died out in the snow. By midday, the field in front of the ridge was scarred with craters, churned with footprints, and scattered with the still forms of men in gray. From his foxhole, Bouck kept shouting into the radio, demanding artillery support. "This isn't just a patrol, it's a battalion down there! We need artillery on that field!" His voice was hoarse, but the message didn't land the way he hoped. Back at headquarters, the duty officer doubted him. To many senior commanders, the idea that a 20-year-old lieutenant and 18 scouts were facing a major German force seemed absurd. They assumed he was misjudging the situation, and scarce artillery assets were kept for other sectors. On the hill, the reality was much harsher. The I&R Platoon was completely alone. No shells exploded among the German ranks to relieve the pressure. No friendly reinforcements appeared on the road behind them. All they had was their rifles, their foxholes, and the ground they had prepared. By afternoon, the Germans shifted tactics. A sniper's bullet smashed into the radio near Bouck's head, destroying their primary means of communication in an instant. The sudden silence on the net was as terrifying as the artillery had been that morning. Cut off from the outside world, Bouck focused on what he could control. He ordered pairs of foxholes to coordinate their fields of fire and had men rig grenades with wires buried in the snow. If an enemy patrol crawled too close, a sharp tug on a line could trigger an explosion they'd never see coming. The improvised traps worked. When German soldiers tried to inch their way up the slope through the thin tree cover, sudden blasts tore through their ranks. Shouts, screams, and then a chilling silence followed. Those precious moments allowed the Americans to reload, rotate positions, and steady their nerves. By late afternoon, the German casualty count was growing. For a few hours, the Americans seemed untouchable, like ghosts in the snow. Miraculously, the I&R Platoon had only one man seriously wounded. But inside the foxholes, the men could feel another problem closing in. They were running low on ammunition. They all knew what that meant. Once the sun went down, the Germans would try something new, most likely a flanking move through the forest, where the foxholes were harder to see. Without enough bullets, even the best defensive positions would eventually be overrun. As daylight faded and the sky turned from gray to deep blue, Bouck weighed his options. The original mission of a scout platoon was not to die in place. It was to observe, delay, and fall back. Part of him still wanted to pull his men out while there was time, but the order from headquarters still echoed in his mind. Hold your position at all costs. He had seen enough of the German buildup to know that if they broke through here, they could pour into the gap behind the American lines. In the end, he stayed. The platoon would fight on the ridge until they couldn't. On the German side, frustration was building. Direct assaults across the open field had failed at a terrible price. Sergeant Vince Kuhlbach, a seasoned NCO, argued for a different approach. Instead of charging straight into the American guns, he proposed a flanking move through the woods to the south. As dusk deepened, about 50 Volksgrenadiers slipped into the forest, using the trees and underbrush as cover. Step by cautious step, they worked their way around the edge of the American line, aiming to appear behind or beside the foxholes rather than in front of them. Up on the ridge, Bouck couldn't see the entire movement, but he sensed that something had changed. The firing from the front flickered and shifted. He began preparing to execute a phased withdrawal, pulling small groups back through the trees to secondary positions farther to the west. Before he could give the order, the sounds he had feared erupted this time from the rear. Gunshots, shouts in German, and the dull thump of grenades echoed among the trees behind the foxholes. The enemy had slipped into their blind spot and was now inside the defensive perimeter. What had been a controlled defense turned into a brutal, close-quarters fight. In some foxholes, men detonated their wired grenades at the last second, blasting the ground as Germans charged in. In others, the defenders fired their last rounds at silhouettes only a few meters away, then faced the cold reality of surrender at gunpoint. During the chaos, a bullet ripped through Bouck's leg, dropping him into the bottom of his foxhole. Blood soaked into the snow as he struggled to stay conscious. Moments later, a German officer jumped in beside him, pressed an MP-40 to his back, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon only clicked out of ammo. Before either man could react, more shots tore across the ridge. The German officer fell dead in the same hole as the wounded American lieutenant. It was a surreal snapshot of the battle. Two enemies, inches apart, sharing the same patch of frozen earth. As the fight raged around them, one by one, the American positions fell silent. Some men were dragged from their foxholes at bayonet point. Others, with no ammunition left and surrounded on all sides, raised their hands rather than be killed. After nearly 10 hours of sustained combat, the ridge finally belonged to the Germans. Exhausted, wounded, and disarmed, the survivors of the I&R Platoon were gathered together. Their captors tied their hands and began marching them back down the hill toward Lanzerath. The men limped past torn barbed wire, shattered trees, and the bodies of the Germans they had held off all day. As Bouck hobbled through the snow, pain burning in his leg, he looked across the field now littered with gray-green uniforms. By any normal measure, they had fought bravely and inflicted heavy losses. But in his mind, only one thought circled over and over. I failed. I didn't hold the line. What he didn't know, what none of the captured Americans could see, was what was happening behind them, miles down the clogged German roads. The day-long fight on that small ridge had done something no one in high command had anticipated. It had thrown off the timing of the entire German advance. That night, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Piper, remained stuck in a massive traffic jam. Tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles idled or crept forward at a crawl. According to Hitler's timetable, they should have pushed through Lanzerath and deep into American rear areas by late afternoon. Instead, they were still short of the village. The reason was simple and ironic. The German paratroopers who had fought all day at Lanzerath reported facing a strong, well-entrenched American force. In their minds, it had to be at least a battalion, supported by heavy weapons and possibly tanks. The idea that only 18 scouts had done this to them never crossed their minds. Those exaggerated reports spread upward through the chain of command. Caution took the place of speed. The fear of running headfirst into a much larger American position made German officers hesitate. They decided to probe carefully, to wait for better light, and to sort out the chaos before committing their armored spearhead. Inside Lanzerath's small Café Schulzen, Bouck and a few of his men were temporarily held as prisoners. Through the windows, they could see German officers arguing heatedly outside. One of them, unknown to Bouck at the time, was Joachim Peiper, the very man tasked with driving the offensive forward. Bouck didn't understand all the German being shouted, but he caught enough words, Amerikaner, Stellung, Panzer, to realize something strange. The officers were talking about a massive American defensive line, about strong positions in the woods, about the need to wait. They were describing ghosts that didn't exist. In that moment, a bitter irony took shape. The Germans believed they had encountered a powerful American formation when, in truth, they had been delayed for an entire day by fewer than 24 men. Bouck, sitting with his hands bound, still believed he had failed his mission. In the days that followed, the advance of Kampfgruppe Peiper never fully recovered its momentum. Those missing hours lost to a stubborn stand on a snowy ridge allowed American units elsewhere to reposition, reinforce key road junctions, and turn temporary delays into permanent roadblocks. Bouck and his men were marched deeper into Germany and scattered among several POW camps. They endured hunger, cold, and uncertainty as the war dragged on. Yet most of them survived until liberation. When they finally returned home, the Battle of Lanzerath faded into the background of their lives. Official U.S. Army histories of the Battle of the Bulge mentioned Lanzerath only in passing, if at all. Without the full picture of German movements and timing, few people understood how important that small ridge had been. For years, the story of the 394th I&R Platoon was all but invisible. It wasn't until the 1,960 seconds, when military historians began carefully reconstructing German and American timelines, that the truth emerged. By lining up the movements of Kampfgruppe Peiper with the stand at Lanzerath, they realized that the main SS armored thrust on the northern flank had been delayed primarily by those 18 men. As the evidence mounted, veterans and supporters pushed for recognition. Letters were written, hearings were held, and slowly the Army re-examined what had happened. In 1981, more than 3 decades after the battle, the surviving members of the platoon were invited to a special ceremony. That day, the U.S. Army awarded 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and 9 Bronze Stars, with V for valor to the men of the 394th I&R Platoon. The unit as a whole received the Presidential Unit Citation. Man for man, they became the most highly decorated platoon of the entire Second World War. Lyle Bouck, once a 20-year-old lieutenant bleeding in the snow, now stood as an older man with graying hair, accepting medals he had never expected to receive. In his mind, the real honor belonged to the faces he remembered on that ridge, young men who had stayed in their foxholes when every instinct told them to run. Their story is not one of grand offensives or sweeping tank battles, but of a single bottleneck on a forgotten hill. 18 cold, exhausted scouts held their ground long enough to make an entire armored division hesitate. In doing so, they helped throw Hitler's last great gamble off schedule and proved how a handful of determined people can make history stall for 20 critical hours. Don't forget to hit subscribe to discover more untold stories of World War II.